The heavy, suffocating silence of 3:17 a.m. was a familiar enemy to Wanjiku Grace. She woke with a violent, ragged gasp that seemed to tear at the very lining of her throat. Her nightdress, damp and clinging, felt like a second skin made of ice. For weeks, the darkness of her bedroom had offered no sanctuary, only a canvas for nightmares that refused to fade upon waking. Tonight, the only illumination was a sliver of pale, ghostly moonlight cutting through the gap in the heavy curtains, casting jagged shadows across the wooden floorboards. Her chest heaved. The phantom smell of sulfur and burning frankincense still lingered in her nostrils, trailing out from the dream she had just been wrenched from. It had felt too real. Far too real. Wanjiku bolted upright in bed, her hands automatically sweeping the mattress until her fingers clamped around the worn leather of her Bible. She held it against her chest like a shield. In the theater of her mind, the imagery was still violently vivid. She had been standing in a cavernous sanctuary, watching Pastor Ezekiel. He was a man she had known for years, a man revered by thousands, but in the dream, he was locked in an invisible, agonizing struggle. She had watched his towering frame convulse, his hands clawing at his own throat as if choking on unseen hands. Finally, his eyes had widened in absolute, paralyzing terror before he collapsed backward into an abyss of absolute darkness. The sheer malice of that darkness still vibrated in her bones. Slowly, her eyes tracked the glowing red numbers of the digital clock on her nightstand. 3:17 a.m. It was the exact minute, down to the second, that had broken her sleep for 21 consecutive days. In the realm of the spiritual, numbers were never a coincidence. They were coordinates. Sliding out from beneath the sheets, her bare knees hit the cold floorboards. She bowed her head over her Bible, her knuckles white. "Lord," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the dark. "Was that dream from you? Is the shepherd in danger, or is the wolf finally showing his face?" The room remained stubbornly, agonizingly silent. No booming voice answered. No gentle whisper stirred the air. But then, as the minutes ticked toward 3:30, a strange, heavy peace settled over the room. It didn't fall like a soft blanket. It descended like a leaden weight, flattening the ambient anxiety in the air. It wasn't an answer. It was just peace. And somehow, that profound stillness frightened Wanjiku more than the nightmare. In her decades of intercession, she had learned a terrible truth about the economy of heaven. Absolute peace was rarely a sign of absence. It was the atmospheric pressure changing before a cataclysm. Peace usually came right before revelation. She stayed on her knees, praying in low, urgent tongues until the ink-black sky outside faded into a bruised purple, and finally into the crisp, golden dawn of a Nakuru morning. By 8 o'clock a.m., the mundane realities of daylight had done their work. The aroma of brewing tea filled her small kitchen, and Wanjiku had almost successfully rationalized the night away. It was just stress, she told herself, wiping down the kitchen counter. A byproduct of the spiritual warfare we've been fighting in this city. Then her phone vibrated against the wood, the screen illuminated with an unfamiliar, 10-digit number. Wanjiku froze, the dishcloth clutched in her hand. Her heart gave a singular, heavy thud against her ribs. She hesitated for 3 full rings before sliding her thumb across the glass. "Hello?" The voice on the other end didn't carry the usual robust greeting of a stranger. It was thin, frayed at the edges, and preceded by a sharp, trembling intake of air. "Madam Wanjiku?" "Yes, I am she. Who is speaking, please?" The man swallowed audibly, the sound transmitted clearly through the receiver. "This is Inspector Mwanji, from the Nakuru Central Police Station." The dishcloth dropped from Wanjiku's hand. "Inspector? Is something wrong? Has there been an accident? We need you to come to the hospital immediately." The provincial annex. "Why?" she demanded, her voice rising. "What has happened?" A suffocating silence stretched over the line. Wanjiku could hear the distant, chaotic murmur of a police radio in the background, contrasting sharply with the officer's hesitation. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, as if he were handling live ammunition. "It's about Pastor Ezekiel." Every muscle in Wanjiku's body locked into place. The kitchen around her seemed to recede into a blur. What happened to him? He was found unconscious this morning inside his private office at the ministry headquarters, Inspector Mwanji said, his voice dropping an octave. The door was locked from the inside. We had to break it down after his secretary noticed he hadn't come out since yesterday evening. Madam, the doctors don't understand what they are looking at. Wanjiku's breath caught in her throat. The terrifying final image of her dream Ezekiel falling into the abyss flashed behind her eyelids with blinding clarity. Is he dead? She whispered, bracing herself for the blow. No, the inspector replied quickly, though there was no relief in his tone. He is alive. For a fraction of a second, Wanjiku let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But the relief was an illusion, instantly shattered by the officer's next words. However, he hasn't spoken a single word since the paramedics brought him in. A physical chill, cold as a winter frost, crawled down Wanjiku's spine. What do you mean he hasn't spoken? Is he in a coma? That's the problem, Inspector Mwanji whispered, moving away from the noise of his colleagues. The medical team says he's entirely awake. His vitals are stable. His eyes are wide open. He can hear people when they speak to him. His pupils dilate. He tracks movement. But he just keeps staring at the ceiling. It's like he's staring through the concrete, looking at something nobody else in the room can see. And his face, Madame Wanjiku. He looks absolutely terrified. The call ended shortly after with a plea for her to hurry, but Wanjiku couldn't move. She sat motionless at her kitchen table for nearly 20 minutes, the phone still pressed to her ear long after the line had gone dead, the dream at 3:17 a.m., the frantic phone call at dawn, the inexplicable catatonia of one of the most powerful spiritual figures in the region. None of it belonged to the natural order. A grand, terrible machinery had been set in motion, and she was standing directly in the center of its gears. By mid-afternoon, the dam broke. What the police had tried to keep quiet became impossible to contain. News of Pastor Ezekiel's sudden hospitalization exploded across social media like wildfire. His mega church, a ministry that boasted tens of thousands of members across East Africa, released a carefully worded yet frantic statement on their official pages. To all sons and daughters of the ministry, we urge you to enter a season of radical fasting and prayer for our spiritual father, Pastor Ezekiel. The enemy has struck the shepherd, but the flock shall not scatter. Stand in the gap for his divine health. The response was immediate and chaotic. By 3:00 p.m., the perimeter of the hospital in Nakuru was completely gridlocked. Wanjiku, arriving by taxi, had to alight 3 blocks away because the streets were choked with vehicles and pedestrians. As she walked toward the medical facility, the atmosphere felt thick, heavily charged with a volatile mix of grief and religious hysteria. Hundreds of people had already gathered outside the hospital gates. Women threw themselves onto the dusty pavement, weeping openly and clutching their prayer shawls. Groups of young men formed tight circles, pacing aggressively, their voices rising in synchronized, militant prayers, binding demons of infirmity and declaring spiritual warfare against the walls of the hospital. To the casual observer, it was a display of profound faith. But as Wanjiku navigated through the crowd, her spiritual senses were screaming. The air didn't smell of genuine intercession. It felt oppressive, laced with a subtle, underlying current of panic. The people were praying to a god they thought they knew, but Wanjiku could see the invisible canopy of gray mist hanging low over the gathering, suppressing their cries. Using her ministerial credentials and the inspector's prior notice, she bypassed the heavy police presence at the entrance and slipped into the hospital. The sterile smell of antiseptic and rubbing alcohol did little to mask the spiritual rot she felt growing stronger with every step she took toward the intensive care unit. Inside the ICU, behind the double-paned glass doors of Isolation Room 4, the atmosphere was completely detached from the noise of the streets below. Here, the silence was clinical, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical hum of life support systems. Pastor Ezekiel lay beneath a white sheet. The inspector had not exaggerated. The man's eyes were starkly open, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights above. His gaze was locked onto a specific corner of the ceiling tile. Unblinking, his pupils dilated to the edge of his irises. Suddenly, without warning, the rhythm of the room broke. The heart rate monitor began to beep erratically, its steady cadence transforming into a panicked, high-pitched whine. Ezekiel's body went rigid. He's seizing. A nurse shouted, lunging toward the bed, but it wasn't a standard medical seizure. Ezekiel began to shake violently, his limbs thrashing with an unnatural, terrifying strength. His back arched so high off the mattress that it seemed his spine would snap. "Get the sedative. Now!" a doctor yelled, rushing into the cubicle, accompanied by 2 male orderlies who threw their weight across the pastor's torso to hold him down. Ezekiel's muscles strained against their grip, veins bulging like thick ropes along his neck and forehead. The sheer force he was exerting was superhuman. He threw one of the orderlies off him with a violent jerk of his shoulder. Then, the thrashing stopped instantly. The sudden stillness was more jarring than the violence. Ezekiel sat perfectly upright on the bed, his torso forming a rigid 90-degree angle. The sheet fell from his chest. The orderlies stepped back, terrified. Slowly, Ezekiel turned his head. His eyes, still wide with that same primal terror from Wanjiku's dream, locked onto the doctor's. The skin around his mouth stretched tight, his lips peeling back from his teeth. For the first time in days, his vocal cords vibrated. The sound that came out was not his usual booming, charismatic preaching voice. It was a guttural, raspy friction. Like stone grinding against stone, he spoke only 3 words: "She's coming back." The moment the final syllable left his lips, the tension vanished from his body. He collapsed backward onto the pillows, his eyes rolling into the back of his head as the machines returned to their monotonous, steady hum. The medical team stood utterly frozen, paralyzed by an inexplicable dread. Nobody in the room knew who she was. None of them understood the catastrophic weight of those 3 words. The kingdom behind the gate miles away, in the quiet sanctuary of her home, Wanjiku was standing in her dedicated prayer room. She was holding a ceramic cup of tea, trying to steady the persistent tremor in her fingers. The exact microsecond Pastor Ezekiel collapsed back onto his hospital bed. Wanjiku's hand spasmed, the ceramic cup slipped from her fingers. It hit the tiled floor and shattered into a dozen jagged pieces, splashing amber liquid across her skirt, but she didn't look down. She couldn't. Without warning, a massive, crushing presence flooded the small prayer room. The air instantly lost its oxygen. The atmosphere became so dense, so physically heavy, that Wanjiku felt as though she were standing at the bottom of an ocean. Her lungs refused to expand. The temperature plummeted until her breath misted in front of her face. Then, the walls of her room dissolved. The physical world vanished, ripped away like a veil. And Wanjiku found herself pulled into a vision of terrifying grandeur and clarity. She wasn't looking at a dream anymore. She was witnessing a reality more real than the ground she had been standing on. She found herself suspended in mid-air, looking down into a valley of unimaginable proportions. The sky above this place was a bruised, twilight purple, choked with ash. The valley floor was not filled with dirt or stone. It was filled with people. Thousands upon thousands. Millions, perhaps. A sea of humanity that stretched over the horizon. There were men in expensive suits, women in rags, children, politicians, and church leaders she recognized from television. Every single face looked hollowed out by an infinite, bone-deep exhaustion. They walked in slow, synchronized circles, their heads bowed low. As Wanjiku looked closer, her breath caught. Wrapped around the neck of every single person in that valley was a heavy, glowing chain. The links were made of a dark, oily energy, completely invisible to the natural eye, binding them to one another. And at the absolute center of this colossal valley stood a monument of pure horror. It was a giant, jagged throne constructed from what looked like black obsidian and petrified bone. Sitting upon it was a creature that defied human comprehension. It was a monstrous serpent, its scales glistening with an iridescent, oily sheen. The creature was gargantuan, easily dwarfing the tallest skyscrapers Wanjiku had ever seen. Its massive, muscular coils wrapped around structures that materialized and dematerialized within the vision. It was wrapped tightly around mega-church cathedrals, around corporate banking headquarters, around government buildings, and around small, broken family homes. As she watched in absolute horror, Wanjiku noticed countless glowing streams of pure, golden light flowing upward from the bodies of the chained people. The light was being drawn out of their chests, siphoned through the air, and absorbed directly into the serpent's scales. Wanjiku knew exactly what that light was. It was virtue. It was spiritual authority, destiny, and life force. The exact same way she had once seen spiritual virtue being subtly drained from unsuspecting church members by false prophets. This creature was doing it on a continental scale. Then, the vision shifted. The colossal serpent slowly, deliberately, turned its massive, terrifying head upward. Its eyes, two burning craters of molten red fire, locked directly onto Wanjiku's ethereal form. The creature did not strike. It simply looked at her. And when it spoke, the sound didn't travel through the air. It vibrated directly inside Wanjiku's skull, like thunder rolling through a desolate graveyard. "You destroyed one servant," the creature hissed. The entire valley trembled at the sound of its voice. The millions of chained souls fell to their knees in unison, groaning in agony. "You fought your little battles in the dark," the serpent continued, its burning red eyes boring into her soul. "You exposed the flaws. You broke the minor altars. But now you have finally seen the kingdom that stands behind him." Wanjiku's spiritual heart pounded against her ribs. She felt naked, completely exposed before an ancient, cosmic malice. The serpent began to uncoil from its throne, rising higher and higher into the ash-choked sky. It grew larger with every passing second, expanding until its massive silhouette completely blocked out the bruised horizon, swallowing what little light remained in the vision. Then, it laughed. It was a horrifying, mocking sound that shook the foundations of the mountains bordering the valley. "You think Pastor Ezekiel was your enemy?" The creature leaned forward, its colossal face inches from hers, its breath smelling of decay and centuries of stolen prayers. "He was only the gatekeeper." Suddenly, the absolute darkness behind the serpent didn't feel empty anymore. In the shadows of the valley, beyond the throne, thousands of glowing, malevolent eyes began to snap open. Not one, not 10, not 100, thousands upon thousands of demonic entities, an entire structured, terrifying army, emerged from the fog. They were all staring at her, watching her, waiting for the signal. The unbroken ninth vision shattered like glass. Wanjiku slammed back into the physical world, falling backward onto the hard-tiled floor of her prayer room. She lay there for several minutes, gasping for air as if she had just been dragged from a deep pool of water, her chest heaving violently. Her skin was drenched in cold sweat, and her hands shook so violently she couldn't press them against the floor to lift herself up. Beside her, where she had dropped it hours ago, her Bible lay open. A sudden, sharp gust of wind blew through the open window, catching the thin pages. The paper flipped rapidly, a soft thwack 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 echoing in the quiet room, before settling on a single page, trembling, her vision blurred by tears of sheer spiritual exhaustion. Wanjiku forced her eyes to move toward the text on the illuminated page. It was Ephesians 6:12. As her eyes scanned the familiar words, the remaining blood completely drained from her face. "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." The word principalities seemed to burn off the page. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. The battle she thought she had won, the exposures, the small victories against corrupt local ministries, the dismantling of Ezekiel's immediate influence had not been the end of the war. It hadn't even begun. She had merely killed a guard at the perimeter fence. The Empire was awake now, far away, inside the sterile white walls of the intensive care unit. The monitors around Pastor Ezekiel's bed suddenly stopped their erratic beeping. The doctor stepped forward to check his vitals, but stopped dead in his tracks. Pastor Ezekiel's eyes slowly snapped open once again. But the terror that had filled them for weeks was entirely gone. The irises, the whites, the pupils, everything had turned a solid, abyssal, midnight black. He looked toward the window, seeing past the city of Nakuru, past the crowds praying on the pavement, straight toward the small house where Wanjiku lay on her floor, and slowly, a terrifying, unnatural smile spread across his face. Tob continued.